Thank you. Well, I am here to talk about business. I ran the U.S.-China Business Council for 10 years, the major organization of American companies involved with China. But I began life as an historian of China and taught for 10 years in university life in the 1970s. And I felt all the way through my years of working with American companies that I was seeing American business with China against the background of, or through the prism of my earlier exposure to modern Chinese history and to China's encounter with the world. And some of that will become clear in my talk today. The title of my talk was obviously created long before I gave any thought to what I was going to talk about, and gives me fairly wide latitude. I would hasten to add, however, that when I used the term night sweats, I did not have anything gender specific in mind. I was thinking about simply kind of waking up in the middle of the night in a sweat, which in fact many American business people do about China regardless of their gender. So it has less to do with hormones than it does to do with the challenges that face people of whatever gender who try to make a living in and with China. Two brief sort of starter anecdotes. I had a first day in graduate school on China, just like John Pomfret did. And on my first day in graduate school, which I also didn't forget, our professor gave us something to take home and read, and it was an article by a professor, then very eminent scholar at Chicago, named He Bingdi. And the gist of it was, or the point that stood out then and stands out even now, so many years later, 40 years later, to me, was that the apogee of late imperial Chinese grandeur and power in the final dynasty, the Qing dynasty, it could be traced almost to a specific year. And the year, if I recall, was 1790, right about 4 or 5 years before the end of the Qianlong Emperor's reign. It was at that point that the Qing dynasty sort of topped out and began to decline. Corruption set in at the highest levels of the court. One thing after another went wrong out in the provinces, and the imperial regime in Beijing proved less and less able to deal with it. By the middle of the 19th century, the West was bashing down the door. A semi-deranged fellow down in Canton concluded that he was Jesus Christ's younger brother and raised a quasi-Christian rebellion that after 14 years was put down at a cost of 40 million lives. The empire dissolved. People began to say, what's wrong with us? Why is the West destroying us after 3,000 years of great civilization? Maybe the answer lies in John Stuart Mill, or maybe the answer lies in Charles Darwin, and the whole ideological structures of the empire began to collapse. So the apex was 1790. Well, coincidentally, that was the year, essentially, that was the year in which the United States became a nation. And it has occurred to me many times over the years, and even now still does, that in the long history of our country, or in the short, whatever you want to call it, in the history of our country, we basically, until about 15 or 20 years ago, never knew a world in which China was a factor to be reckoned with. It was something to be taken care of. I stopped by this terrific used bookstore after lunch here, the ABCD bookstore, around the corner, and I bought, and you should go. They have a Things Chinese by J. Dyer Ball. They have Arthur Smith, Village Life in China. They have great books over there, including a Carl Crow for $160 that I couldn't afford. But I did buy for $8. Modern China, a civics reader for middle school students by Henry Blair Graybill, principal of the middle school, Canton Christian College, written in English in 1925 to help introduce the Chinese kids in his Christian college to concepts of patriotism, love of your country. This is in China. And the sort of outlook of a modern citizen of a modern nation. Well, there were a lot of Americans doing that in 1925, and it was part of the American ethos toward China that our job was to help China free itself from the shackles of blind and ancient and ignorant traditions, whether through Christianity or through capitalism or through whatever. So the uplift of China, as one author wrote, was part of the American perception of our role in relation to China. China needed uplifting, and it's certainly between invasion and famine and everything else, it was so bedraggled and political collapse that it was certainly in need of some form of assistance as Americans saw it. And for the rest, we saw China as essentially damned by its own unyielding ignorance and traditionalism. The sleeping giant, we've all heard the cliches, this sort of immovable, immobile, place that was so wrapped up in its own cultural isolation and self-satisfaction that, in fact, it had, in a way, to be kicked into modernity at the point of a cannon if it wouldn't otherwise start trading and acting like a normal modern nation. But the concept of China as a really big-time player who could really make a difference to the way the great powers of the world conducted their own and the world's affairs, that did not exist until quite recently. And I've always remembered that as I've dealt with the politics of and the business of American business with China in recent years. The other thing I would say as a quick anecdote was that I spent 10 years in DC. Most of that time I lived in Cabin John, Maryland, and every day I would get in my car and I would get in my Toyota Corolla and I would get on Massachusetts Avenue and I would drive to work. And invariably I got behind a Lincoln Navigator or a Cadillac Escalade. I mean, a sort of a 17-ton SUV, usually out of Potomac, Maryland. And I would drive to work, and I conceived of this as a sort of a metaphor for China. That is, you drive along sucking CO2 from the Lincoln Navigator. You can't see the sky, you can't see the stoplights, you can't see the curb. The Lincoln Navigator driver is in his or her plush surround sound splendor, totally unaware of the fact that the peons are dragging along in his wake. And I won't bore you with the radical alternatives that peasants sometimes come up with in order to turn the world upside down. But let me just say that as we look at China in the world economy, I do think it's true that China does not, I mean, it may have conceived of itself when this gentleman wrote his book on how to develop pride in your country for middle school students at Christian colleges in China in 1925. China today does not see itself as ordained by heaven to suck anybody else's CO2. That is not the image. It's partly the inflated and radicalized rhetoric with which the Maoists took power and preserved power in the 1950s and 60s. It's partly play acting. But it also goes deeper than that because China now, over the last 20 years, has compiled a track record. And while not everybody is rich, and many people are struggling, and some are suffering very badly still, nevertheless, the difference between what China was and what China is evident to a great many people in China. And they see, in a sense, for the first time since this tragic and conflicted encounter with the modern world began, the possibility that they're really getting it right this time. And sucking CO2 from the American or the European or the Japanese Cadillac Escalade, as long as GM survives, that is not part of the destiny. Now to business. I'll actually move rather quickly through business. The days of the kind of myth of the China market are over. That is the magical belief that 400 million customers or 1 billion customers or 2 billion armpits or whatever it might be meant instant wealth for American companies. Those days are long past. Part of that was folly, but more to the point, American companies now, many American companies have been in China for 10, 15, 20 years. They've structured up for China. They have China offices, they have China operations, they have manufacturing, they've got human resources departments, they've got the structures of a business life operating in that international market or that international environment, just as they do in India or Brazil or whatever country else they might be in around the world. In many ways, China is becoming a normal international business venue for American businesses, as it is for Europeans and Japanese and South Africans and New Zealanders and everybody else. But the second point is that while the myth of the China market may never be as entirely filled with sugar plums as my title conjured up, there really is a China market now. And there, for the time being at least, is every sign that that market is going to continue to grow. I mean, when people in the 19th century said if one family in 5 will buy a piano, our piano factory will run forever. Or if every, quote, Chinaman, unquote, adds 1 inch to the length of his shirt tails, as all of our China specialist friends have heard 1 million times, our cotton mills in Lancashire will run forever. A lot of that was wishful thinking. If they were too poor to have shirts, then the extra inch on the shirt didn't make much difference. The China market was always illusory and elusive. But in fact, today there really is a China market, and a lot of American companies are going to China, increasing numbers going to China, because they seek to bring their products and services into that market. I mean, read the stories. It's not just products. Look at FedEx, look at UPS, look at the logistics world. Increasingly look at banking, although there are uncertainties in that zone, but nevertheless look at the way American banks and Western banks are now seeking to buy pieces of extant and very large Chinese banking operations. The economy, in other words, presents now the prospect of a large internal market, which is of strong and growing appeal to American businesses in many fields. On top of that, of course, businesses go to China for reasons which used to be unfamiliar but are now familiar. They go to China because China is a manufacturing platform, and the manufacturing that they used to do perhaps in Rockford, Illinois, but also perhaps in Taiwan or Korea or somewhere else around the rim, is now moved to China, and they source from China. They source products from China which they take in finished form into the international marketplace, including the American marketplace itself. A quick asterisk on that. Remember that something like 65% of the value of China's exports to the United States is accounted for by imports to China from other countries where the components are made. China, to a very large extent, not entirely, but to a very large extent, remains an assembly point with low-cost labor and a good infrastructure and, now a pretty well-developed system of this kind of contract manufacturing. China remains an assembly point for the putting together of final products, which then move out made in China to the US, but a very significant proportion of the value of those products is accounted for by componentry that is brought in from other countries, particularly around the rim. But anyway, American companies go to China to produce, partly to produce for the domestic market, but also obviously to produce for markets here. Investors are beginning to go to China, more than beginning, and even venture capital firms are beginning to head to China. There is a lot of talent there. And there are a lot of business ideas, 99% of which are going to be disasters, but the other 1% of which, with some very highly motivated and talented and educated people behind them, could turn out to be real business opportunities. So we see Wall Street and we see venture capital firms very strongly interested in China right now. They are settling in for the long haul. This is no longer, a mystery. We're not talking about, scenic boatmen paddling their little boats across the Li River in Guilin anymore, and peasants smiling over bountiful harvests. This is just, it's like going to Chicago, and they're structuring up and developing their personnel around a prolonged, long-term presence in China and activity with China. Competition is extremely heavy, gruesomely heavy in many cases, and increasingly is coming from Chinese firms themselves. Again, they don't want to suck CO2 forever. The Chinese have been licensing American and Western European technology since they set out on this course toward rapid modernization, but they don't particularly like it. They'd rather own their own technology. We'll leave aside the question of stealing technology for a few minutes later in this talk. And so, in fact, both in the sense of development of indigenous technology and technical standards, but also in many other ways. You can go to Walmart. You can go to Walmart in China and get a lot of the things you can get at Walmart too. The Chinese are happy to put up competition for foreign firms in China, and the foreign firms feel that competition increasingly heavily. The manpower pool is growing, and generally speaking, you could say that with the passage of 25 years since the late 70s when Deng Xiaoping kicked this off, China has been on a path of general convergence with the broad mainstream of international business, trade, and investment. That is to say, to a degree unimaginable 20 years ago, lots and lots of Chinese people now walk the walk and talk the talk. Now, years ago, I was interviewed by Elaine Scialino of the New York Times, who was asking why the Chinese couldn't seem to get their act together in Washington, D.C. the way Taiwan did. Taiwan was so effective, and China was so bumbly. And I said to Elaine, hey, come on, this is not rocket science. The Chinese can learn to walk the walk and talk the talk. The next day I got a call from the embassy. Mr. Kapp, this is Mr. Wu. I read your interview in the New York Times this morning, and you said China can learn to walk the walk and talk the talk. Could you tell me, please? What is walk the walk and talk the talk? Well, at least on the business side, those days are largely over. I mean, it's true that you can talk the talk sometimes before you can walk the walk, and Americans need to be careful to make sure that the people they're dealing with can both talk and walk. But by and large, what has happened is that more and more people have been exposed to international practice, to the English language, to training in the States and elsewhere around the world, and are becoming internationally adept business people. And American business benefits clearly benefits from that gradual convergence of the two cultures, no matter how many other differences there might be. The manpower pool is growing, although China remains in short supply in key technical and managerial ranks, but still it is growing. The landscape perpetually shifts. We were walking over to lunch, and I was saying to my host that Camden reminded me a little of a metaphor I used to use in distinguishing China and Japan in the days when everybody thought they were all one and the same. And my metaphor was that it was conjure up a Christmas tableau from a shopping mall with a beautiful little New England town, sort of Norman Rockwell, on white sheets or on imitation snow, with a beautiful little congregational church and little houses with little incandescent lights inside signifying warmth and comfort, and little people taking their little Christmas trees home, and the little dog barking and everything peaceful and silent night, and then pouring a big pot of caramel over the whole thing and letting it harden to absolute impermeability. And that was Japan. Everything was kind of stuck. You couldn't get your knife under the edge of this institutional glue, which held business, bureaucracy, the various key actors in the Japanese economic and social and political environment into this kind of lock set. Whereas in China, the exact opposite was the case, and everything was in flux. Laws changed day to day. The meaning of laws was reinterpreted. The jurisdiction of agencies overlapped or conflicted. And a lot of that fluidity, that turbulence of the environment is still very much the case in China. And American companies have to start with that understanding. You don't go to China because you know and will always know how to do business there. I mean, the first thing you go with is the recognition that some guy could leave his job and get another job, and the new guy may have a very different view of what you're doing and put you in a very difficult situation. It is very, very fluid. And I will now begin to turn in the direction of some of the ways in which China remains a real challenge, even in spite of the convergence and the greater familiarization that I was talking about. Every serious company in China has a government relations operation now. Yes, it is becoming a market economy. No, they are no longer conducting the economy along the planned economy lines of the Maoist period, let alone along the radical and ideologically extreme lines characteristic of the Cultural Revolution. A very, very high percentage of the economy now operates according to principles of supply and demand. There are only a few sectors which are rigidly controlled by the state nowadays, including, for example, oil and some others. So yes, that's part of the convergence. On the other hand, if you think you can go to China and run your company without constant attention both to the makers of the policy and, most importantly, to the carriers out of the policies and the regulatory measures that affect your business, you're dead. You're just absolutely dead meat. It is a constant interaction with your regulators in particular. I mean, one of the companies I consult for is a direct sales company. Think of Avon, think of Amway, think of Mary Kay. And I tell you, I mean, the Chinese look at the American style of direct selling and they say, wow, first of all, fraud is likely. That is, you get these poor, ignorant peasants to give you their money, and in return, you give them foot massaging machines made in Taiwan that break down the first time you use them. The peasants are out the money, and the pyramid schemers or the scam artists take the money and run. So they're worried about crime in the sense of fraud. But the other thing they're worried about is heterodox sects. You know, these direct sales companies, they wear pink, or they have special songs and rituals. You know, this is the stuff of which the younger brother of Christ in 1850 raised the Taiping Rebellion. They had special songs. They had special colors and flags and rituals, and 40 million people were dead by the time they were finally taken care of. So you know, this government, which wants to employ people and wants to get people thinking entrepreneurially, they also look at things like direct selling, which the Chinese have to open under WTO. It's in their agreements. And they say, we're going to regulate this thing until they just can't budge. They're going to have to just walk like this. And so the direct sales companies there, or other clients of mine and most American companies, are constantly watching the issuance of regulations, the redefining of regulations, the canceling of old regulations, and those regulations are usually both onerous and imprecise. They leave great ranges of latitude for individual officials to invoke them, and upon invoking them, to interpret them. So that becomes an ongoing feature of the Japanese landscape, of the Chinese landscape, I'm sorry. The Japanese landscape, as I said, is all under caramel, so we don't have to talk about it today. That remains an enduring feature which probably is not going to go away in our lifetime. When I was a PhD student, I used to go down into the stacks of the Yale Library and pick up off the shelf these, I used to blow the dust off, but I would pick up these great fat books about this fat called things like 财政年鉴 or 内政年鉴. These were the annual almanacs of finance and internal administration put out by the KMT government in the 1930s. There was one in 1934, 35, 36. And you could open them up to any page, and it would say, Chapter 6432, and it would be some law that had been duly put out by the legislative body of the time in this new and struggling republic. The Chinese had set out to establish a nation of law by writing a law for everything, and the laws were of just unthinkable length and detail. And of course, we all learned, and as graduate students, that it all went down the tubes 13 years later when the nationalists were driven off the mainland, and there were lots of reasons for that. Well, there's a little of that quality today. The Chinese are just putting out laws to beat the band. We've said to the Chinese, the world has said, if you're going to be a part of the world, you've got to have a system based on stable and predictable law. The Chinese said, right, stable and predictable law, we like it. So the laws are pouring out, and the regs, because once you've got a law, you've got to have implementing regulations. And that's, I mean, in a sense, it's where the trouble begins. I mean, I won't say that American companies are thinking, gee, wouldn't it be great if we didn't have any law here. They wouldn't say that. But nevertheless, it creates this gigantic verbal environment. Reading this stuff is just mind-glazing. And at the end of the day, it leaves still a huge range of discretionary behavior between the companies and the officials who implement those laws and regulations that remains the zone of a vast amount of American effort. Now, as Americans pursue their business in China, and many are doing very well, the AmCham, I guess in Beijing the other day, came out with another statement, their annual survey, and it shows that a very high percentage of American companies are now willing to admit out loud that they're making money there. The companies used to be diffident about that because they didn't want the Chinese tax man looking at them too carefully. But a lot of companies are now saying, yeah, we've finally gotten the bugs ironed out, and the system is getting better, and things are more regularized, and we're making money, and we're growing the business, and we have greater ability now to buy into Chinese enterprises and sometimes take them over. FedEx and UPS have just bought out their Chinese partners and are going to be wholly owned. More American companies are now operating their own wholly owned structures over there because it gives them greater flexibility to make decisions and hire and fire and operate the way they might elsewhere. So businesses are generally feeling pretty good. At the same time, though, business exists in a larger environment of that I want to spend a few minutes on before my time runs out. In this country, and to some extent in China as well, commercial activity is part of a much larger moral discussion which never ends. And I won't bore you with the details because we're all Americans, or most of us are, and we've lived in this society. But you know, the United States is not of one mind about many things relating to business. We love entrepreneurs, and we love success. We are very uneasy, at least many Americans, not all Americans, but those of us who don't hunt quail are very uneasy. I'm sorry, I apologize. I take it back. No. Believe me, I knew I was in this audience when I said it, but let's just strike that and go on. You know, a lot of Americans are not comfortable about the notion of business as a completely amoral enterprise with no responsibilities to society at large. Obviously, most Americans really of all stripes understand that with economic and profit-making activity goes some very serious ethical issues, both in terms of the probity of individual business people's conduct, the requirements that they live up to the law, as we've seen in so many of the problems of large companies on Wall Street in recent years, but also in terms of the impact of business on the surrounding society. That morality play goes on in the pages of our newspapers every day about American business in general, and it certainly goes on in the pages of our newspapers about American business and on the web about American business in China. We also like success, but we're uneasy about size. Let me just guess. It isn't really a guess because I know from the Saltzmans that it's a reality. Let's just guess that the building of a supersized Walmart along Route 1 somewhere within 20 miles of here would cause controversy. The fact is that Walmart's a great thing. You can really save money and put your money into your kids' education, et cetera, by all the savings you reap at Walmart, but there are other issues. We all know that. And the same, I think, is true for Americans generally about sometimes when they look at corporate size and the growth of very, very large corporate organizations which seem to have disproportionate power over the lives of those who are not a part of them. That gets drawn into the discussion about China. The whole question of American values, about which we would perhaps agree in broad outline and disagree in greater detail. The whole question of American values and the responsibility of Americans, whether in corporate life or otherwise, to uphold or even to propagate and instill those values when they are living and working outside of the United States, comes rushing to the fore on China in this country, in the media, in Congress, and elsewhere. It goes back to this era. It goes back much earlier than this era, to the 1870s and 80s and 90s, but it's still with us, and China in that sense remains particularly controversial more of the time than most other countries. And on top of that, we could talk about it later, I sometimes think that China becomes the vehicle or the instrument or the sort of proximate cause, one of many, but an important one, for a growing sense of uneasiness or even a crisis of confidence in the United States about our own national future. This is not universal, and I don't mean to get into one of those Jimmy Carter things about malaise all over again. It's a little late in the day for that. But when you find people who are worried about their personal futures and by extension the future of the country, I think you find the emergence of China as a strong and economically competitive presence in the world to be one of the factors that enters rather quickly into the discussion when people wonder where we're going. And we could go on about that at length. My point is that American business in China is part of something much larger. And now, briefly, let me say that often takes a political form. China is a hot topic. It's just never going to go away. I learned in Washington on about the second day I was there in 1994 that resolved issues equal unemployment in Washington. And the last thing you want to do is actually have definitive resolution of something, because then you've got to find a job. So those in the China field don't have to worry. And I don't know whether I'm going to see Shambaugh nodding up and down or Pillsbury or others, but the fact is that China is, the themes are old. Many of them go way back before 1949 or 1978 when we established, 1979 when we established diplomatic relations, or 2001 when the EP3 landed in Hainan Island. They go way back, but China is politically sensitive. China is endowed with moral significance in the American political process for some of the reasons I tried to touch on a minute ago. And it remains a very, very sensitive topic, particularly in the Congress. There are many reasons for that. If you save 13 cents at the Walmart because the handkerchief you bought is not affected by high tariffs, you don't call your congressman and say, hey, vote for open trade, I saved 13 cents. Now, if 200 million Americans save 13 cents on a handkerchief because we have low tariffs, that's real money, but nobody calls Congress. When you go to the plant and there's a sign on the gate that says we're closing this Friday and we're moving our production to Mexico or China or anywhere else, you're in deep trouble, and you pick up the phone and you call Congress. There is no, in my view, no organized body of active legislative initiative taking in support of a strong U.S.-China relationship in the Congress. There are significant nodes of members of Congress who have very strong concerns about China for military and security reasons, economic reasons, and others, who are often ready to consider at least legislation in which China is targeted for its alleged or actual misconduct. But there's very little by way of an ongoing, non-crisis-driven consensus in the Congress in support of a strong and growing U.S.-China relationship. And that's not altogether bad, because the flip side of that is that the White House saves the Congress from its own mistakes. That is, Congress can fulminate and bloviate, my favorite word. Congress can get up on its hind legs and make a lot of noise, and it does regularly. There are, at any given time, 30, 40 bills in the Congress targeting China for and seeking to bring punitive measures against China for its misconducts, whether over currency or trade or investment or anything else. But the White House normally, you can get up on your hind legs knowing that ultimately it's not going to make that much difference, because the White House is never going to sign, or the House will save the Senate's bacon, or the Senate will save the House's bacon, and therefore the heated rhetoric is not necessarily the same thing as the creation of a genuine crisis with China. But the dynamic goes on and on and on, and it never stops. And there are very, very strident, or at least very, very energetic voices, some of them driven by very strong ideological views, which put the confrontation or the engagement with an emergent China into the context of a larger view of world affairs and a larger view even of the history of human affairs that makes for a rich mix of China issues integrated with other aspects of American foreign policy and of America's sense of itself. So China politics in Washington go on and on and on. In that, business has a role, and occasionally a real role. I mean, when it came to changing American law to make sure that the United States treated China as a full WTO member when China joined the WTO, China having agreed to all the concessions that we had forced them to agree to in order to secure our acquiescence to their joining the WTO. When it came to passing legislation to change American law to make sure we were going to give China full WTO treatment and thus reap the benefits that we had negotiated, yes, business did the heavy lifting. Business got together and we organized and we pushed and we we won the vote. But under normal circumstances, business is passive and quiescent. When the voices of anger and concern and retaliation arise over China's alleged or actual malfeasances, whether it be toward Taiwan or whether it be on the currency or anything else, business tends to be unorganized. They want to avoid politics. Imagine, business wants to avoid politics. They also have 50 different issues on the desk of each member of Congress. So they have to ask themselves, well, do we really want to get in there? I mean, is this really life and death? Do we really want to get in there with Representative so-and-so on this? When in fact, you know, we've got that water pollution problem down there, you know, on the river in southern Tennessee, and we need his vote on that. So business tends to be passive until there's a crisis, but when there's a real crisis, it gets organized, and you only have to hope that it doesn't organize too late. In the case of the China National and Offshore Oil Unocal matter, I personally was of the view that business was inexcusably passive and silent, but others who are perhaps with us here today may have a different view of that. Finally, the China bet. I mean, is this now a sure thing? No. I mean, the same thing could be said about almost anywhere. China is not a sure thing. Other speakers this morning, including both Professor Brown's great presentation, and in fact, everybody's talk this morning has helped us to understand that China is a work in progress, such a cliche, and that all questions have not been answered. The banking and financial system talks a good line now. They're preparing to list on international exchanges. Citigroup or Bank of America is going to put in 30 senior bank managers for 10 years or whatever the number is, just to help them to help the bank in which they are investing in China bring itself up to world-class standards of probity and transparency. Citigroup is doing the same. There's a lot of talk about the banks shucking off their bad loans and so forth and so on. But realistically speaking, they're not out of the woods on that yet. And they've been talking the same line about how we need a culture change in the banking system for 20 years. Intellectually, the leadership knows they need a culture change. But if you're the Bank of China, is it the Bank of China that has 40,000 branches? One of the smaller banks, so to speak. Or you know, ICBC, which is even bigger, if you've got 60,000 branches, just saying in Beijing, we need a change in the banking culture. We need a culture of risk-based lending. You know, it's easy to say they've all been to Harvard, they've all read Alan Greenspan, but making it happen is a whole other matter, and I don't think they're out of the woods on that. And there are other risks. The assumption of linearity of 9.5% growth, just because the Chinese have grown at 8 or 9% for year after year after year now, and created these undeniable achievements of higher per capita income and extraordinary gross GDP growth and foreign trade growth and so forth. It doesn't, I think, mean, and I suspect many Chinese deep down inside understand that it doesn't necessarily mean that that linearity goes on forever. And I think there are some possibilities of trouble. Let me just mention a few and then I'll stop. China has not, in fact, resolved its political structure problems yet. Problems that began with the disintegration of thousands of year-old imperial institutions in the mid and late 19th century. There are a lot of questions that are still not answered. When the Chinese shut down the weekend supplement to one of their newspapers the other day, a supplement called Freezing Point, the reason they shut it down was that a humble professor from Zhongshan University in Guangzhou put up an article, or posted an article at Freezing Point, published an article at Freezing Point, which was about mistakes in Chinese history textbooks, which conveyed to the average Chinese middle school student of 10 or 12 years old a vision of the Boxers. You remember the Boxer Rebellion when we were kids, back in 1900? An image of the Boxers as heroic fighters against foreign imperialism, and totally ignored and whitewashed the fact that there were a bunch of crazed religious fanatics slaughtering Chinese in anybody who got in their way, and so forth. This guy said, wait a minute, we got to be realistic here. The Boxers were not just heroic freedom fighters defending the realm against the nasty foreigners. They were, in fact, profoundly ignorant, culturally isolationist, violent fanatics. And this same professor wrote another very interesting article on his blog about the fact that at the local level in China, down at the village level, administration and criminality are one and the same. That is, no, it's not like Rock. No, this time I disagree. This isn't like Rockport. No. We're talking about the persistence through decades and decades and even a century and more of socio-political disorganization and ferment, of a level of criminality based often on what we would call criminality and what he called criminality in the article, based on clan, based on holding of local special secret society ties, based on the use of force, the ability to beat up peasants if they don't knuckle under to the threats and the extortions exercised by people in this kind of netherworld of criminal activity. And he wrote that, in fact, local administration is interwoven. That is, the people who hold title at the local level are all interwoven with, as they try to accomplish their tasks of governance, with this criminal element that ultimately can beat people on the head if they don't comply. Well, I myself worry a little about in a state which is not federal, in a state which is linear and unitary, where the lower reports to the next, higher to the next, to the next, to the next, right up to Beijing, I worry a little about how long the political order can sail ahead if the bases, the feet of that political order are badly diseased and crumbling. And while the average American company is not down there in the village where the local mafias are working in cahoots with the village leaders to squeeze money out of the peasantry or to seize their lands and sell them off to real estate developers. Most American companies are not down there. Nevertheless, there are things about the political administrative system in the country which should be cause for concern and part of the political risk analysis that every business does. I remain concerned more. I'm a worrier, and my Chinese friends all know that. I think that the coming of the Olympics in 2008, into which the Chinese have invested enormous psychological resources as well as financial ones, raises the possibility that everybody's going to assume that China is over a barrel. They can't have anything go wrong between now and 2008, lest it scotch or tarnish their Olympics. They can't start shooting people down on the streets. They can't have a war with Taiwan. They can't do a lot of things because it'll wreck their total national investment in the global recognition and the global prestige that comes with the Olympic Games. And I think at least there's the possibility that opportunists of all kinds will see 2008 as a date against which and before which to see whether they can cause difficulties within the country. The possibility of a perfect storm in relations with the United States is there. I don't give it a lot of emphasis, but the United States and China have a lot of things on the table and off the table that they don't like about each other. And there are ways in which the signs of a downward spiral can be perceived already. This is particularly true in the security sector, where each side feels that the other side poses a threat and tries to prepare itself to meet that threat, leading to a further escalation of the same preparatory process back and forth. Taiwan is out there. But I don't myself think that unless we have a major downturn in the economy of the United States, that we are likely to see all the different dissatisfactions in the United States with regard to China coming into a single perfect storm of such force that the United States would take actions against China that would lead the Chinese to retaliate with such economic or other decisiveness that the whole relationship was shaken off its pins. I don't think it's there, partly because we need them to buy our treasury bonds, partly because they need us to buy their T-shirts, for a lot of reasons. The economic relationships are very, very heavy and integrated now. I don't think it's going to happen, but there are a great many irritants out there, all of which should be and largely is on the plate of American companies. Let me stop with that. I've gone too long. I apologize for doing so, but we'll take a few questions as time permits. Thanks.